How far would you go to uncover the truth? For one detective, the answer was simple: as far as it takes. Not just any investigator, this was a former Metropolitan Police officer with decades of experience tackling organized crime. But this time, he wasn't after gangsters, drug lords or fraudsters. His target? The most powerful political force in Britain today. And what he uncovered is nothing short of explosive. For 6 months, this seasoned investigator embedded himself within Labour's inner circle. Not as a journalist, not as a whistleblower, no, he played the long game. He posed as a wealthy donor, a passionate supporter of so-called progressive policies. Because in politics, money talks. And if you have enough of it, the doors to the highest echelons swing wide open. Local meetings, high-profile fundraisers, exclusive dinners with cabinet ministers, he was there for all of it, meticulously recording over 200 hours of conversations that reveal a side of Labour the public was never meant to see. They mocked voters, scoffed at their own promises, and laid out secretive policies they would never dare announce on television. If you thought politicians were deceptive before, brace yourself, because this goes far beyond broken promises. One revelation towers above the rest, a moment so grotesque, so staggeringly cynical, that it makes a mockery of everything Labour claims to stand for. A recording of Labour ministers laughing, yes, laughing, as they discuss dismantling NHS England, calling it a necessary sacrifice. Imagine that for a second. The very people who brand themselves as the protectors of the NHS, sneering as they strategize how to rip it apart behind closed doors. Let's be clear. This isn't just about backroom discussions or ideological disagreements. This is an outright betrayal. The same Labour that marches into election campaigns waving NHS banners and warning of Tory privatisation has been secretly plotting to gut the system themselves. And they're not even ashamed. They joke about it, knowing full well the British public would be outraged if they ever found out. But this isn't the only deception at play. What our detective uncovered is far more insidious. Labour isn't just lying to the public, they are actively scheming to extract more money from ordinary Britons through a series of concealed tax hikes. Their public message? No tax rises for working people. Their private plan? A labyrinth of new financial burdens, carefully disguised as necessary reforms. One proposal that sparked particularly vile amusement among ministers: ending national insurance exemptions for working pensioners. They know exactly what this means. Thousands of elderly Britons, many already struggling to make ends meet, suddenly finding themselves hit with a new tax they never expected. And the worst part? They don't care. One minister, ice clinking in his glass at a private dinner, casually remarked, "They've had it good for too long." Just let that sink in. These are people who preach about fairness, who claim to stand for the vulnerable, chuckling over the prospect of pensioners being forced to pay hundreds more in taxes simply for trying to stay afloat. It doesn't stop there. Capital gains tax? Set to skyrocket, punishing small business owners and entrepreneurs who dared to build something for themselves. Inheritance tax? Expanded, despite Rachel Reeves publicly denying such plans. Land value tax? Branded as council tax reform to fool the public into thinking it's something entirely different. If you thought Labour's economic deception was bad, what our detective uncovered next is truly sickening. Because there is one betrayal so heinous, so morally bankrupt, that it defies belief: Labour's deliberate cover-up of grooming gang scandals to protect their electoral interests. One of the most damning recordings captures a senior Labour official stating, with chilling bluntness, "We can't talk about this publicly. The Pakistani community votes for us in huge numbers. We'd be finished in dozens of constituencies." Read that again. Labour officials calculated how many votes they would lose if they spoke openly about one of the most horrific scandals of our time: child exploitation at the hands of organised grooming gangs. And they decided staying in power mattered more than protecting victims. This isn't speculation. Our detective sat in on meetings where they actively discussed messaging strategies to deflect attention from the ethnic background of offenders. He recorded advisors boasting about pressuring police forces to omit certain details from public statements. One of the most revolting moments. A Labour advisor laughing as he recalled successfully convincing law enforcement to avoid mentioning the Pakistani background of suspects. For them, this wasn't about justice, about accountability, about safeguarding the most vulnerable. No, it was a political game, a chessboard where the victims were mere pawns to be sacrificed for electoral advantage. And if you're still wondering whether this was just a few rogue officials, think again. Internal labor documents obtained by our detective prove that this was a systematic strategy, meticulously calculated down to the very last vote. Constituency by constituency, they weighed the cost of addressing the scandal versus the cost of staying silent. And they chose silence. This is what modern labor stands for. Not principles, not integrity, but cold political calculus. And it gets worse. While they were laughing about tax rises and covering up crimes, they were also plotting how to dismantle the NHS while pretending to save it. Do you remember when West Streeting stood in Parliament, solemnly announcing the abolition of NHS England as a measure to improve efficiency? Our detective recorded him admitting in private that he had absolutely no intention of doing this before the election. So why do it now? The answer is brutal. We can cut thousands of jobs but frame it as removing wasteful bureaucracy, and people will actually thank us for it, a senior health minister declared in a closed-door meeting. This isn't about efficiency. It's about centralizing control, slashing costs, and making room for private contracts, all while feeding the public a carefully crafted narrative of modernization. And what about the 9,000 NHS jobs that Labour is set to cut? When an official voiced concerns about the inevitable backlash, another minister waved it off. Look, you can't make an omelette without breaking some eggs. Eggs? That's what NHS staff are to them, just expendable ingredients in their political master plan. What our detective exposed is not just Labour's hypocrisy. It is their absolute contempt for the British people. They think voters are too stupid to notice their tax deceptions. Too distracted to realise they are gutting the NHS. Too politically conditioned to question why they protected grooming gangs for votes. And if these recordings hadn't been obtained, they would have gotten away with it all. Now the question is, will you let them? They laughed. They actually laughed. As they sat in their exclusive private dinners, sipping expensive wine and surrounded by political allies, Labour ministers openly mocked the British public, ridiculing the very people they claim to represent. Not just about policies, not just about opposition parties, they laughed about how they were going to take more of your money, behind your back, while pretending to be on your side. The deception is not just shocking, it is deliberate, calculated, and meticulously planned. Labour knows it cannot announce sweeping tax hikes publicly, because it would be political suicide. So, what do? They repackage, rebrand, and reframe their tax grabs under deceptive labels. No one is calling it an increase, no, it's about closing loopholes, about fairness, about necessary modernization. And by the time the public realizes what's happened, it will be too late. Let's talk about one of the cruelest moves in their secret tax agenda, the removal of national insurance exemptions for working pensioners. Imagine your elderly neighbor, who spent decades working, now stocking shelves at a supermarket just to afford heating and groceries. Under Labour's private plans, she will suddenly find herself hundreds of pounds worse off, not because she earned more, not because she was reckless, but because Labour believes she's had it too good for too long. That's not an exaggeration. One Treasury minister was recorded openly stating that pensioners benefiting from exemptions were getting away with it and should be paying their fair share. The audacity is staggering. This isn't about fairness. It's about milking those who have already contributed their entire working lives. And it doesn't stop there. Labour's plan to increase capital gains tax to match income tax levels will devastate small business owners and entrepreneurs. Picture the local baker who has spent 40 years running a shop, waking up at 4 a.m. every day, building something to pass down or sell for retirement. With Labour's tax hikes, that retirement plan is obliterated. The government will take an obscene cut, far higher than before, because they view individual success as something to be punished, not rewarded. Then there's inheritance tax, Labour's most cynical deception yet. Rachel Reeves has repeatedly gone on record saying she has no plans to expand it. She has denied it outright, looking voters straight in the eye and telling them Labour would not touch inheritance tax. But in private? That's a different story. At a closed-door meeting with major donors, Reeves was caught admitting that expanding inheritance tax is absolutely on the table. Her exact words? "We promise things in public and do other things in private." That's politics. No shame, no hesitation, just a cold, calculated admission that the British public is being deliberately lied to. And the list goes on. Labour wants to introduce a new land value tax, a stealth property tax disguised as council tax reform. The idea? Families who have worked their entire lives to pay off their mortgages may suddenly find themselves facing massive new tax bills on the very homes they thought they owned outright. For Labour, home ownership isn't something to be celebrated, it's a source of untapped revenue, waiting to be exploited. This isn't about fiscal responsibility. It's not about fairness. It's about power. One of the most chilling moments captured in the detective's recordings comes from a high-ranking Labour strategist who, between sips of wine at a private function, openly admitted how they would sell these tax hikes to the public without causing a backlash. People don't understand tax structures. They hear reform and they assume it's good for them. We call it a council tax adjustment instead of a land tax, and they won't realize what's happened until the bills come in. Read that again. They are literally banking on the public being too uninformed to notice what's happening to them. They depend on confusion, on manipulation, on disguising their tax hikes so cleverly that by the time people realize they've been robbed, it's already done. And while they chuckled at their own deceit, while they clinked their glasses over how cleverly they were pulling the wool over Britain's eyes, the detective sat there, listening, recording, documenting every word. These are not the actions of a government that cares about its people. These are the actions of a government that views the public as a revenue stream to be milked dry, as pawns to be manipulated, as obstacles to their unchecked control. What's perhaps even more disturbing is the sheer contempt Labour officials showed for those who dared to question these plans. One insider asked what they would say if the media picked up on their tax strategies before they could be implemented. The response? Laughter. One minister scoffed, "We're the good guys. The press won't touch it." Because they believe that as long as they brand themselves as the party of the people, they can get away with anything. They have no fear of scrutiny, no accountability, no respect for the public's intelligence. And let's not forget, this is all happening while they look you in the eye and tell you they will not raise taxes. This is what Labour is when the cameras are off, when they believe no one is listening, when they sit among their inner circle and speak freely. They laugh at you. They mock you. They plot new ways to take your money while telling you it's for your own good. This is deception on a massive scale, a political con job so elaborate that it would be almost impressive if it weren't so appalling. And now you know. The question is, what will you do about it? They knew. They all knew. The reports, the testimonies, the police investigations, Labour was fully aware of the scale of child exploitation at the hands of organized grooming gangs. But instead of taking action, instead of standing up for the most vulnerable members of society, they calculated the political cost and decided that votes mattered more than justice. Think about that for a second. How many innocent children suffered while Labour politicians sat in meetings, strategizing not about stopping these crimes, but about how to cover them up? How many lives were shattered while officials nodded along, fully aware of the horrors being committed under their watch? The answer is horrifying. And now, thanks to an undercover investigation, we have the proof. A senior Labour official was caught on tape, his words as cold as they were damning. "We can't talk about this publicly. The Pakistani community votes for us in huge numbers. We'd be finished in dozens of constituencies." That single sentence encapsulates everything that is rotten in modern politics. Not just the hypocrisy, not just the moral cowardice, but the sheer, calculated betrayal of innocent victims for political gain. Labour didn't just ignore the problem, they actively protected these gangs because confronting the truth was too inconvenient for their electoral strategy. And this isn't some vague allegation. This is documented, recorded, undeniable. The detective sat in those meetings. He listened as advisors discussed how best to manipulate the narrative, ensuring that any mention of the perpetrators' backgrounds was scrubbed from public discourse. Not because it was inaccurate, but because admitting the truth would cost them votes. One of the most shocking moments in the recordings? An advisor laughing about how they had successfully pressured police to omit the ethnicity of suspects from press statements. Let that sink in. The people responsible for upholding the law, for ensuring justice, were instructed to downplay the facts, to conceal crucial information, not for the sake of community cohesion, but for political expediency. And while Labour ministers and their strategists patted themselves on the back for dodging scrutiny, while they sat around in private functions congratulating each other on their crisis management, the abuse continued. More victims, more ruined lives, more families torn apart. Because the truth didn't matter. Only the votes did. The scale of Labour's moral bankruptcy is breathtaking. They didn't just turn a blind eye, they made a conscious decision to suppress discussion, to silence victims, to manipulate law enforcement into treating the issue as taboo. Internal documents obtained by the detective confirm that they had detailed projections of how many votes they would lose if they admitted the truth. Spreadsheets, calculations, constituency breakdowns. Cold, ruthless mathematics, where victims were not seen as children in need of protection, but as political liabilities. One of the most chilling moments in the tapes captures a Labour minister dismissing the issue outright. It's a complicated subject. Best to let the public forget and move on. Forget? Move on? How do you move on from the institutional betrayal of thousands of vulnerable children? How do you simply forget that the people elected to protect the public actively shielded predators for the sake of political convenience? This isn't just an administrative failure. This is a deliberate, systemic cover-up, an absolute dereliction of moral and ethical responsibility. And it gets worse. Because when honest members of law enforcement tried to raise the alarm, when police officers and whistleblowers spoke out, what happened? They were silenced. They were accused of racism, of fearmongering, of undermining social cohesion. Their careers were threatened, their reputations attacked, all because they dared to tell the truth. Because that's what Labour built, a culture of silence, enforced by fear and political correctness, where speaking out was more dangerous than the crimes themselves. And make no mistake, this was not about protecting community relations. The vast majority of British Pakistanis would be just as horrified by these crimes as anyone else. This was about Labour's selfish, ruthless pursuit of power, no matter the cost. And while they sat around their strategy tables, while they crafted talking points and planned their next election cycle, while they ensured police reports were worded carefully to avoid controversy, real children suffered unspeakable horrors. The human cost of Labour's betrayal is immeasurable. Children who should have been safe, protected, supported, instead abandoned, dismissed, sacrificed at the altar of political ambition. And here's the most damning part: Labour continues to block a full, independent inquiry into these grooming gang scandals. Why? Because they already know what it would reveal. They already know how deeply complicit they are. They already know that once the full truth comes out, their carefully maintained facade of moral superiority will collapse in disgrace. So they continue the deception. They issue carefully worded statements, feigning concern while ensuring that the true scale of the scandal is never fully exposed. They weaponize political correctness to stifle discussion, labeling anyone who dares to bring up the uncomfortable facts as a bigot, as a racist, as someone trying to create division. But this isn't about division. It's about justice. Because what's the alternative? That we stay silent while more children are victimized? That we accept that some crimes are too politically inconvenient to prosecute properly? That we allow those in power to decide which victims matter and which ones don't? And here's the final question: how many other issues are they hiding? If Labour was willing to suppress one of the most horrific crimes imaginable to protect their political interests, what else have they buried? Because this is what happens when a party believes it is untouchable. When they believe their grip on power is more important than truth, more important than justice, more important than human lives. This isn't about left or right. This isn't about political ideology. This is about the fundamental duty of any government to protect its people, and Labour has failed in the most unforgivable way possible. The question is, now that the truth is out, will the British public let them get away with it? They knew exactly what they were doing. The private meetings, the whispered conversations, the carefully calculated rhetoric, it was all designed to deceive. Labour isn't just mismanaging the NHS, they are deliberately dismantling it, and they are doing it in a way that ensures you won't notice until it's too late. For years, they have built their political brand on the idea that they are the NHS's last line of defence. They have weaponized the public's fears of privatisation, scaremongered about conservative cuts, and paraded themselves as the only party that can protect the institution. And yet, when the cameras are off, when they believe no one is listening, the truth is very different. A recording obtained from within Labour's inner circle exposes the real plan. Where Streeting himself admits that the abolition of NHS England is not about reform, but about power, about gaining control, cutting jobs, and setting the stage for further privatisation. This is not about efficiency. This is about erasing oversight, removing obstacles, and making it easier for ministers to dictate policies that serve their interests rather than the public's. And what happens when you remove NHS England? You remove the independence that allows medical professionals to push back against damaging political decisions. You remove the safety net that prevents reckless budget cuts. You remove the transparency that lets the public see what's really going on behind closed doors. The consequences are chilling. 9,000 jobs set to be slashed under the guise of eliminating bureaucracy. That's thousands of people, administrators, medical staff, frontline workers, all being sacrificed on the altar of so-called efficiency. When asked about these job losses in a closed-door meeting, a senior labor official dismissed the concerns with a smug, callous remark. "Look, you can't make an omelette without breaking some eggs." Eggs? That is how they view NHS staff, not as essential workers, not as people who dedicate their lives to public service, but as expendable casualties in their political chess game. And while they make these brutal cuts, they are also paving the way for privatisation, ensuring that services once freely available to all will soon have a price tag attached. More outsourcing, more contracts quietly handed to private firms, all while keeping the public distracted with promises of modernisation. One particularly damning recording reveals a senior health minister explaining how they would spin this move without triggering a public backlash. People will be so focused on the restructuring itself that they won't notice the contracts shifting to private partners. This is how Labour operates. They don't announce their real agenda. They disguise it. They manipulate the messaging. They sell you a lie while executing policies that are the exact opposite of what they claim to stand for. And what's their plan for when the public starts to notice? It's so predictable it's almost laughable. Blame the Conservatives. Another leaked recording captures a minister explicitly strategizing how to shift responsibility onto the previous government. Just tell people we inherited a mess, and this is the only way to fix it. They'll buy that for at least the first couple of years. It's not just dishonest. It's insulting. They believe the public is so gullible, so easily misled, that they can gut one of the most cherished institutions in British society and convince people they are saving it. And while all of this is happening, another equally sinister conversation was recorded, discussions about slashing disability benefits. Keir Starmer, the same man who presents himself as a champion for the vulnerable, was caught privately complaining that disability benefits are too generous. The same party that claims to stand for social justice, the same politicians who lecture the public about compassion, see disabled people as a burden to be managed, not as citizens who deserve support. Labour officials were recorded discussing ways to quietly reassess disability benefit criteria, removing recipients without formally cutting the programme itself. It's a bureaucratic trick: eliminate thousands from the system through technicalities, then claim you haven't actually reduced the support. When a junior minister raised concerns about the impact this would have on disabled people struggling to make ends meet, they were shut down by a senior colleague with chilling indifference. We can't let individual sob stories dictate national policy. That is the real face of Labour. They pretend to care, but behind closed doors, they see struggling citizens as inconvenient statistics. This isn't just hypocrisy, it's a deliberate betrayal of the very people who placed their trust in them. And all of this, the NHS dismantling, the backdoor privatisation, the cuts to disability support, is happening while Labour continues to insist, in public, that they are defending the welfare state. It is a political con of breathtaking audacity. They will raise your taxes in secret, while claiming to be on the side of working people. They will cut essential services, while insisting they are investing in the NHS. They will ignore some of the most vulnerable in society, while parading themselves as their protectors. This is the truth about Labour when the cameras aren't rolling. Their mask of compassion is slipping, revealing the cynical, power-hungry machine underneath. And the question remains, will Britain wake up to the deception before it's too late?